There's a moment in every woman's life when she realizes that the people she trusted most have been orchestrating her downfall all along. For me, Laurel Hector, that moment came in the mahogany-paneled study of my childhood home in Charleston, South Carolina, on a rain-soaked Thursday evening that would shatter everything I believed about family loyalty and blood bonds forever.
Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're a subscriber, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Tell us a duh.
My name is Laurel Hector, and I need to tell you about the night I discovered that my own family had been planning to steal my inheritance for months, using a fabricated emergency as the perfect cover for their deception. At 68 years old, having spent 4 decades building a quiet life as a freelance architectural consultant, I thought I understood the complexities of human nature. I was devastatingly wrong. The call came on a Tuesday morning in late October, just as I was reviewing blueprints for a sustainable housing project in Portland, Oregon, where I had made my home for the past 15 years. My sister Agnes's voice was trembling with what sounded like genuine panic as she delivered news that sent my world spinning. "Laurel, you need to come home immediately," Agnes said, her words tumbling over each other in a rush that seemed born of desperation. "It's Aunt Coral. She's had a massive stroke, and the doctors don't think she's going to make it through the week. She's been asking for you specifically, saying she needs to see you before it's too late." The words hit me like a physical blow. Aunt Coral Abernathy had been more than just my father's sister. She had been my mentor, my confidant, and the closest thing to a mother I'd had since my own mother passed away when I was 12. Coral had taken me under her wing during those difficult teenage years, teaching me about architecture, about business, and standing up for myself in a world that often dismissed women's voices. "How bad is it?" I managed to ask, my hand already reaching for my laptop to check flight schedules. "Bad, Laurel, really bad. She can barely speak, but she keeps saying your name. The whole family is gathering, but she specifically asked for you to handle, well, you know how she's always trusted your judgment with important matters." I did know. Coral had often confided in me about her concerns regarding other family members' financial habits. She had built a considerable fortune through her chain of boutique hotels along the eastern seaboard, and she had frequently expressed worry about leaving that legacy to people who might squander it. More than once, she had hinted that she was considering significant changes to her will. "I'll catch the first flight out," I told Agnes, already mentally calculating travel time. "Can you send me the hospital information?" "Actually," Agnes said, and there was something in her tone that I should have recognized as manipulation. "The doctors think it would be better if we handled any legal discussions at the house. You know how much she loves that old place, and they're allowing us to bring her home for her final days. It might be more comfortable for everyone." The request made sense at the time. Coral's antebellum mansion had been in our family for generations, and she had always said she wanted to die in the 4-poster bed where she had been born. The idea of handling sensitive family business in the familiar surroundings of the family home seemed both practical and emotionally appropriate. I spent that entire Tuesday afternoon and evening making arrangements. I contacted my current clients to explain the family emergency, rescheduled meetings, and arranged for a colleague to oversee the Portland project in my absence. I packed quickly but carefully, including the professional clothes I thought I might need for what Agnes had delicately termed legal discussions. The flight from Portland to Charleston gave me 6 hours to prepare myself emotionally for what I assumed would be Coral's final days. I found myself remembering our last conversation just 3 months earlier, when she had called to tell me about some exciting changes she was planning to make. She had been characteristically cryptic, but there had been an energy in her voice that suggested she was preparing for something significant. "Laurel, my dear," she had said during that call, "I've been thinking a lot about legacy lately. Not just money, but real legacy, the kind that actually makes a difference in the world. I think you're going to be very pleased with some decisions I've been making." At the time, I assumed she was referring to her ongoing philanthropic work or perhaps some new business venture. Coral had always been entrepreneurial, even well into her 70s. The possibility that she might be planning changes to her inheritance arrangements had crossed my mind. but I had never presumed to ask directly about such personal finance matters. The taxi ride from Charleston International Airport to the family estate took me through neighborhoods where I had spent my childhood, past landmarks that carried decades of memories. The Spanish moss hanging from ancient oak trees created a canopy that filtered the late afternoon sunlight into something dreamlike and nostalgic. This was the Charleston of my youth, where family meant everything, and blood bonds were considered sacred and unbreakable. Coral's mansion sat on 12 acres of carefully managed grounds, with gardens that had been featured in Southern Living magazine multiple times over the years. The house itself was a testament to antebellum architecture, with its sweeping wraparound porches, towering white columns, and floor-to-ceiling windows that had witnessed more than 2 centuries of family history.
As my taxi pulled up the circular driveway, I could see several cars already parked near the main entrance. Agnes's silver Mercedes was there, as was the black BMW that belonged to my nephew Justin Hale, Agnes's eldest son. I also recognized the red Jeep that belonged to Justin's wife Maddie, and what looked like a rental car that might have belonged to other family members who had traveled from various parts of the country. The sight of so many family vehicles should have been comforting, evidence that Coral was surrounded by people who loved her during her final days. Instead, something about the scene struck me as oddly staged, though I couldn't articulate why at the time. Perhaps it was the way the cars were arranged, as if they had been parked with deliberate care rather than the haphazard urgency typically associated with a medical emergency. I paid the taxi driver and stood for a moment in the circular driveway, breathing in the familiar sense of magnolia blossoms and Charleston's distinctive humid air. The house looked exactly as it always had, stately, welcoming, and filled with the kind of old-money elegance that suggested stability and permanence. I had no way of knowing that I was about to walk into the most elaborate betrayal of my life. Agnes greeted me at the front door with what I now recognize was a perfectly rehearsed performance of grief and exhaustion. Her usually immaculate silver hair was slightly disheveled, her makeup artfully smudged as if she had been crying, and she wore a black cashmere sweater that struck just the right note of somber elegance. "Oh, Laurel, thank God you're here," she said, embracing me with trembling arms. "It's been such a nightmare. Poor Coral has been drifting in and out of consciousness, but every time she wakes up, she asks for you." I followed Agnes through the familiar grand foyer with its crystal chandelier and marble floors that had intimidated me as a child and inspired me as an adult when I chose to study architecture. The house felt different somehow. There was an electricity in the air that seemed inconsistent with the solemnity of a deathbed vigil. "Where is everyone?" I asked, noticing voices coming from the direction of Coral's study, rather than from upstairs where her bedroom was located. "We're all gathered in the study," Agnes explained, her hand guiding me firmly toward the back of the house. "The doctor suggested we let Coral rest for now, and frankly, we needed to discuss some practical matters while we have the chance. You know how she's always been about having her affairs in order." The mahogany-paneled study had always been Coral's sanctuary, lined floor-to-ceiling with leather-bound books, dominated by an enormous desk that had belonged to our great-grandfather, and anchored by a massive stone fireplace that gave the room a warmth that somehow made even the most difficult conversations feel manageable. As we entered the room, I was surprised to see not just family members, but also 2 men I didn't recognize. One was elderly, with thinning gray hair and wearing an expensive suit, while the other was younger, perhaps in his 40s, with the kind of polished appearance that suggested legal or financial expertise. Justin Hale rose from one of the leather armchairs near the fireplace, his tall frame and dark hair reminding me powerfully of his late father, Agnes's first husband, who had died in a boating accident when Justin was just 15. At 38, Justin had inherited his father's good looks, but had developed a sharp edge that sometimes made me uncomfortable during family gatherings. "Aunt Laurel," he said, crossing the room to embrace me with what seemed like genuine warmth. "I'm so glad you could get here quickly. We really needed you here for this." His wife Maddie stood beside the window, her red hair catching the last rays of afternoon sunlight. She had always been perfectly pleasant during family gatherings, but there was something about her expression today that I couldn't quite read, a tension around her eyes that seemed inconsistent with someone focused solely on Coral's health crisis.
Laurel, I'd like you to meet some people, Agnes said, gesturing toward the two strangers.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
This is Mr. Quentin Curtis, Coral's estate attorney, and this is Mr. Jasper Abernathy, no relation, just an unfortunate coincidence of names. He's a financial advisor who's been helping Coral with some recent planning decisions. I shook hands with both men, noting that Curtis had the firm grip and direct eye contact of someone accustomed to handling substantial estates, while Abernathy seemed nervous, avoiding prolonged eye contact and fidgeting with a leather portfolio. "I'm sorry we're meeting under these circumstances," Curtis said, in a voice that carried decades of experience with family crises. "Coral spoke of you often and with great affection. She was very specific about wanting you involved in these discussions." "What kind of discussions?" I asked, settling into the chair Agnes indicated while glancing around the room for any sign of medical equipment or evidence of Coral's presence in the house. Agnes exchanged a look with Justin that lasted just a fraction too long, the kind of wordless communication that suggested prior planning. "Well," Agnes began, "as you know, Coral has always been very private about her financial affairs, but given the circumstances, she felt it was important to share some information with the family." Curtis opened a thick manila folder on the coffee table between us. "Your aunt recently made some significant changes to her estate planning. She wanted to ensure that her assets would be protected and properly managed, given the complexity of her business holdings and real estate portfolio." I nodded, though something about the formal tone of this conversation felt wrong. If Coral was truly dying upstairs, why weren't we focused on spending time with her rather than discussing legal documents? "The thing is," Justin interjected, leaning forward with an expression of concerned sincerity, "Coral became worried about some of the beneficiaries named in her previous will. She was concerned about their ability to manage substantial inheritances responsibly." Jasper Abernathy finally spoke, his voice carrying a slight tremor. "Miss Hector, your aunt was particularly concerned about certain family members who might not understand the complexities of managing business assets, real estate holdings, and investment portfolios." A cold sensation began forming in my stomach. "What exactly are you saying?" Agnes reached over and patted my hand with what was clearly meant to be a comforting gesture. "Sweetheart, Coral felt that some family members, through no fault of their own, simply lack the business experience necessary to preserve and grow her legacy. She wanted to ensure that her assets would be managed by people with the right expertise." Curtis pulled several documents from his folder. "Your aunt executed a new will 3 weeks ago. She asked me to explain the changes to the family, particularly to you, since the new arrangements affect everyone significantly." I stared at the documents he was spreading across the coffee table, trying to process what I was hearing. Where is Coral? I want to talk to her directly about this. The silence that followed my question lasted just long enough to be uncomfortable. Agnes and Justin exchanged another look, and I caught Maddie turning away from the window with an expression that looked almost like guilt. "She's resting right now," Agnes finally said. "The medication makes her very drowsy, and the doctor said we shouldn't disturb her unless it's absolutely necessary. She specifically asked us to handle these explanations so she wouldn't have to repeat everything multiple times." Something in Agnes's tone triggered a memory of childhood conversations when she would create elaborate explanations for things that didn't quite add up. Even as children, I had noticed that Agnes had a talent for making lies sound reasonable, for creating complex justifications for simple deceptions. "I'd like to see her," I said firmly. "Even if she's sleeping, I just want to sit with her for a few minutes." "Of course," Justin said quickly. "But first, don't you think we should finish reviewing these documents? Coral was very specific about wanting you to understand the new arrangements before anything happens." Curtis began explaining the legal documents with the kind of detailed precision that seemed designed to overwhelm rather than inform. As he spoke about trusts and fiduciary responsibilities and asset management, I found myself focusing less on his words and more on the dynamics in the room. There was something choreographed about this entire scene, the way everyone seemed to know their roles, the way questions I asked were answered just a little too quickly, the way no one seemed particularly concerned about actually checking on Coral's condition. And then Jasper Abernathy made the mistake that would unravel everything. "Miss Hector," he said, consulting his notes, "under the new arrangements, your inheritance has been restructured to ensure proper professional management. Rather than receiving assets directly, you'll receive a managed monthly distribution that reflects your lifestyle needs." The phrase lifestyle needs hit me like a slap. It was condescending in a way that Coral would never have been, suggesting that I was somehow incapable of managing my own financial affairs despite having successfully run my own consulting business for decades. But more than that, something about Abernathy's phrasing seemed wrong. Too precise, too calculated, as if he had rehearsed those exact words. "What lifestyle needs?" I asked, my voice sharper than I had intended. "What exactly has Coral told you about my financial situation?" The question hung in the air like a challenge, and for the first time since I arrived, I saw cracks in the carefully maintained facade of family unity and legal necessity. Agnes's composure faltered for just a moment, and in that instant, I saw something in her expression that chilled me to the bone. It was the look of someone who had been caught. The silence that followed my question stretched uncomfortably long. I watched as Agnes's carefully composed mask of grief slipped just enough to reveal something calculating underneath, something that reminded me of the sister who used to steal my allowance and then help me look for it. "Well," Agnes said, recovering quickly, but not quickly enough, "Coral was concerned that you might not be familiar with managing such substantial assets. You've always lived so simply, so modestly. She just wanted to make sure you'd be protected from making any unfortunate decisions." The condescension in her voice was unmistakable now, and it triggered a flood of memories I had been unconsciously suppressing for years. This wasn't the first time Agnes has spoken to me as if I was somehow less capable, less intelligent, less worthy of respect than she was. I remembered the Christmas 3 years ago when Agnes had accidentally seated me at the children's table during family dinner, claiming there wasn't enough room at the main table even though I could clearly see an empty chair between her and her husband Gary. When I had quietly mentioned it, she had laughed it off as a silly mistake while making no effort to correct it. There was the time she had organized a family reunion and somehow forgotten to send me the updated invitation with the correct date, leaving me to arrive a day late to find everyone already deep into celebrations. "Oh, Laurel," she had said with exaggerated sympathy, "I thought I told you about the change. You've always been so scattered about details." But scattered about details? I was an architectural consultant whose entire career depended on precision and attention to detail. I had managed complex construction projects worth millions of dollars, coordinated with teams of engineers and contractors, and never missed a deadline in 20 years of independent practice. "Agnes," I said slowly, my architect's mind beginning to analyze the structural flaws in the story I was being told, "when exactly did Coral have this stroke? You said Tuesday, but what time? Which hospital? I'd like to speak with her doctors directly." Justin shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "Aunt Laurel, I don't think interrogating the medical staff is really necessary right now. We should focus on what Coral wanted us to discuss." "I'm not interrogating anyone," I replied, my voice taking on the firm tone I used with contractors who tried to deviate from agreed-upon specifications. "I'm asking basic questions that any family member would ask about a loved one's medical emergency. Where is she being treated? Who is her attending physician? When can I see her?" Maddie finally turned from the window, and I caught something in her expression that looked almost like pity. She's resting comfortably upstairs. The doctor said family visits should be limited to avoid overwhelming her." "What doctor?" I pressed. "What's his name? Is he here now?" The pause that followed was telling. Curtis cleared his throat and began shuffling papers with unnecessary vigor, while Jasper Abernathy seemed to find something fascinating about the contents of his coffee cup. Agnes's jaw tightened in a way I remembered from childhood arguments. Dr. Morrison from Charleston General. But Laurel, honestly, this fixation on medical details is exactly the kind of intensity that worried Coral about your judgment. The accusation was so absurd it was almost laughable. Intensity about medical details? Any reasonable person would want to know specifics about a dying relative's condition and treatment. The fact that my family was characterizing normal concern as problematic intensity was itself a red flag the size of a billboard. I stood up abruptly, causing everyone in the room to tense. I'm going upstairs to see Coral, right now. Laurel, please, Agnes said, rising as well. You just got here. You're tired from traveling. Maybe you should take a few minutes to process what we've discussed before... Before what? I interrupted. Before I see my dying aunt? Before I ask her directly about these mysterious will changes that apparently happened without any input from the person who was supposedly most affected by them? Justin exchanged another look with his mother, and this time I caught the full weight of their silent communication. It was the look of conspirators whose plan was beginning to unravel. Actually, Curtis interjected, with the smooth professionalism of someone accustomed to managing difficult family dynamics, perhaps it would be helpful if I explained the legal requirements for the new arrangements before you speak with Coral. There are some time-sensitive documents that need to be executed, and it would be beneficial if you understood the full scope of the changes. Time-sensitive documents? The phrase sent alarm bells ringing in my head. In my experience, legitimate legal changes to estate planning rarely require immediate action from beneficiaries, especially during medical emergencies. The urgency felt manufactured, designed to pressure me into making decisions without adequate time for consideration. I thought about the phone call that had brought me here. Agnes had been so specific about Coral asking for me, about her wanting to handle legal discussions at the house rather than the hospital. But now that I was here, I wasn't being taken to see Coral at all. Instead, I was being subjected to a presentation about legal documents that supposedly reflect her wishes. "Show me the will," I said suddenly. Curtis blinked. "I'm sorry?" "Show me Coral's new will. If she executed it 3 weeks ago and it affects my inheritance so significantly, I want to read the actual document, not summaries, not explanations, the actual legal language." The request seemed to surprise everyone in the room. Curtis glanced at Agnes, who looked at Justin, who seemed to find the carpet pattern suddenly fascinating. "Well," Curtis said carefully, "the document is quite technical. It might be easier to review the summary first and then—" "I'm an architectural consultant," I said firmly. "I read technical documents for a living. I think I can handle legal language." The truth was beginning to crystallize in my mind like a chemical reaction reaching completion. The reluctance to let me see Coral, the vague medical details, the time-sensitive legal documents, the condescending assumptions about my capabilities, all of it pointed to one inescapable conclusion. "Where is Coral?" I asked again, my voice cutting through the tension in the room like a blade. What I couldn't hear was any evidence of medical equipment, nursing staff, or the hushed activity typically associated with caring for a dying person. Agnes finally spoke, her voice defensive. "Laurel, I don't appreciate your tone. We're all grieving here, and your accusations are hurtful and inappropriate."
But I wasn't making accusations yet. I was asking questions. The fact that she interpreted my questions as accusations told me everything I needed to know about the defensibility of the answers she wasn't giving. I walked to the study door and paused with my hand on the brass handle. "I'm going upstairs to see Coral. If anyone tries to stop me, I'm calling the police and reporting a possible elder abuse situation." The threat hung in the air like a lit match near gasoline. For the first time since I had arrived, I saw genuine fear flicker across Agnes's face. And in that moment, I knew with absolute certainty that whatever was happening in this house, it wasn't what they had told me. Coral wasn't dying upstairs. The question was, where was she? I climbed the familiar mahogany staircase with my heart pounding.
each step on the worn Persian runner echoing memories of childhood visits when I would race up these same stairs to find Coral in her bedroom, surrounded by architectural drawings and business documents. The silence from the study below felt ominous, too quiet for a group of people who should have been following me to prevent a grieving niece from disturbing a dying woman. Coral's bedroom door was closed. I knocked softly and waited for a response that didn't come. When I turned the ornate brass handle, the door opened to reveal a room that looked exactly as it always had, perfectly maintained, elegantly appointed, and completely empty. The four-poster bed was made with military precision, its antique quilt smoothed to perfection. There was no medical equipment, no sign that anyone had been sleeping here recently, no indication whatsoever that this room was serving as anyone's sick room. The air smelled faintly of the lavender sachets Coral had always kept in her dresser drawers, not the antiseptic smell of medical care or the stuffiness of a room where someone was confined to bed. I checked the adjoining bathroom, the sitting area by the windows, even the walk-in closet. Nothing. No signs of recent occupation, no medical supplies, no evidence that Coral had been anywhere near this room in days. The guest bedrooms told the same story. Pristine, unoccupied, clearly prepared for visitors who hadn't arrived yet. I even checked the servants' quarters on the third floor, spaces that hadn't been used for their original purpose in decades, but that Coral sometimes converted to temporary offices during busy periods. By the time I made my way back downstairs, my shock had crystallized into something much more dangerous: cold, analytical anger. The kind of anger that came from having my intelligence insulted and my emotions manipulated by people who assumed I was too naive or too trusting to see through their deception. The study had fallen silent when I re-entered. 5 pairs of eyes watched me with expressions ranging from defiant to guilty to calculating. Agnes sat rigidly in her chair, her hands clasped so tightly in her lap that her knuckles were white. Justin had moved to stand behind his mother's chair in a gesture that looked protective but felt threatening. Maddie remained by the window, but her posture had shifted from casual to tense. Curtis and Abernathy looked like men who were beginning to realize they might have made a serious miscalculation. "There's no one upstairs," I said quietly. Agnes lifted her chin with the kind of manufactured indignation she had perfected as a teenager when caught in lies. "Of course there is. Coral is resting in the guest room at the end of the hall. The master bedroom was too difficult for the medical staff to navigate with their equipment." "I checked every room on the second floor, Agnes, and the third floor. There is no medical equipment anywhere in this house. There are no medical staff. There is no evidence that anyone has been receiving care here." "You must have—" "Where is Coral?" I interrupted, my voice carrying the authority I used when dealing with contractors who tried to substitute inferior materials without authorization. And this time, I want the truth. The silence stretched until Curtis cleared his throat nervously. "Ms. Hector, I think there may be some confusion about the timeline." "No," I said firmly, "there's no confusion. There's deception. Coral isn't here. She hasn't been here. The question is whether she's actually had a stroke at all, or whether this entire emergency is fabricated." Justin stepped forward, his expression shifting from concerned nephew to something harder and more calculating. "Aunt Laurel, I think you're letting emotion cloud your judgment. This is a difficult situation for everyone, and making wild accusations isn't helping anyone." "Wild accusations?" I turned to face him directly. "I'm stating observable facts. Fact 1, you told me Coral was dying upstairs. Fact 2, there is no one upstairs. Fact 3, you're all trying to pressure me into signing legal documents without allowing me to verify the circumstances that supposedly necessitate those documents." Maddie finally spoke from her position by the window. "Maybe we should call Dr. Morrison to clarify the medical situation." "Excellent idea," I said immediately. "Let's call him right now. What's his number?" The pause that followed was telling. Agnes and Justin exchanged another look, and I could practically see them trying to calculate whether they had prepared for this contingency. "It's quite late," Agnes said weakly. "We shouldn't disturb him unless it's an emergency." "His patient is supposedly dying," I replied. "If that's not an emergency, what is?" Curtis stood up abruptly, gathering his papers with movements that seemed designed to end the conversation. Perhaps we should postpone this discussion until tomorrow, when everyone has had time to process the emotional weight of these circumstances.
But I had spent too many years in business negotiations to be dismissed by evasive lawyer speak. Mr. Curtis, have you actually met with Coral Abernathy in the past 3 weeks? The question hung in the air like an accusation. Curtis's eyes darted to Agnes before returning to me. I've been working with the family to ensure that Miss Abernathy's wishes are properly documented and executed. That's not what I asked. Have you personally met with Coral Abernathy? Have you spoken with her directly about these will changes? Has she signed any documents in your presence? Curtis's silence was answer enough. I pulled out my phone, and the sight of it seemed to galvanize everyone in the room. "What are you doing?" Agnes asked, her voice tight with something that sounded like panic. "I'm calling Coral directly." I scrolled through my contacts until I found her number. If she's dying, she should at least be conscious enough to speak with me briefly. If she's not conscious enough to speak, then she certainly wasn't conscious enough to make major changes to her will 3 weeks ago. "Laurel, don't," Justin started forward, but I was already pressing the call button. The phone rang once, twice, 3 times. Then I heard Coral's voice, strong and clear and very much alive. "Laurel, sweetheart, what a lovely surprise. I was just thinking about you." The sound of her voice, healthy, energetic, completely normal, hit the room like a bombshell. Agnes went pale, Justin stopped mid-step, and Curtis looked like a man who had just realized his entire strategy had collapsed. "Coral," I said, my voice carefully controlled, "I'm at your house in Charleston. Agnes called me yesterday and said you'd had a stroke. She said you were dying and asking for me." The silence on the other end of the line lasted just long enough for me to hear my own heartbeat. When Coral spoke again, her voice carried a dangerous edge I had rarely heard before. "I'm in Savannah, dear. I've been here for 2 weeks visiting my friend Eleanor Whitmore. I haven't had a stroke, I'm certainly not dying, and I have no idea why Agnes would tell you such a thing. But I think I'm beginning to understand what's happening there." I looked around the room at 5 people who had just been caught in an elaborate lie, and I felt something shift inside me, something that had been dormant for years, but was now awakening with the force of a hurricane. "Coral," I said, keeping my voice steady despite the rage building in my chest, "I think you need to come home immediately, and you might want to bring your real attorney with you." The moment I ended the call with Coral, the atmosphere in the study shifted like air pressure before a storm. Agnes had gone from pale to ashen, Justin's confident posture had crumbled into something defensive, and the 2 supposed professionals looked like men who suddenly realized they might be facing serious legal consequences. "Now," I said, my voice carefully controlled, "I think it's time for some honest answers. Starting with who you really are," I directed this at Curtis and Abernathy, "and what exactly you thought you were going to accomplish here." Curtis began gathering his papers with jerky, nervous movements. "I think there's been a misunderstanding. Perhaps we should reschedule this discussion for another time." "Sit down," I said sharply. The authority in my voice was something I had developed over decades of managing construction crews and demanding contractors, but I had never used it on family before. "No one leaves this room until I understand exactly what scheme you've been running." Jasper Abernathy was the first to crack. "Look, Miss Hector, we were just following instructions. Your sister contacted us about helping with some family financial planning, and we thought—" "You thought what, exactly? That you could forge documents, impersonate attorneys, defraud an elderly woman out of her inheritance?" I pulled out my phone again, because those are federal crimes, gentlemen. Agnes finally found her voice, though it came out as more of a croak. "Laurel, please, let me explain. It's not what it looks like." "Really? Because it looks like you fabricated a medical emergency to get me here so you could pressure me into signing away my inheritance rights based on fraudulent documents? What part of that assessment is incorrect?"
The silence that followed was broken only by the grandfather clock in the hallway chiming 8 o'clock. It had been less than 2 hours since I had arrived at what I thought was my dying aunt's bedside, but it felt like a lifetime. Justin finally spoke, his voice lacking the confident charm he had displayed earlier. "We weren't trying to hurt anyone. We just thought, Mom has been struggling financially since Dad died, and with your lifestyle in Portland, we didn't think you really needed—" "Stop," I interrupted. "Just stop talking before you make this worse for yourselves." I walked to Coral's desk and sat down in her leather chair, feeling the weight of family history around me. This desk had witnessed decades of important decisions, business negotiations, and family discussions. It felt appropriate that it would witness one more crucial moment. "Here's what's going to happen," I said, opening Coral's desk drawer and pulling out a legal pad. "First, Mr. Curtis and Mr. Abernathy, you're going to write down your real names, your actual professional credentials, if any, and exactly how much my sister paid you to participate in this fraud." Both men began to protest, but I held up my hand. "Second, you're going to hand over any documents you've prepared, any materials you brought here, and any recording devices you might have been planning to use to capture me supposedly agreeing to these arrangements." Curtis's face went red. "I'm not required to."
Third, I continued, ignoring his protest, you're going to sit quietly while I call the local police and report this attempted fraud. Then you're going to explain to them exactly what you thought you were doing here. The threat of police involvement seemed to shift the dynamic in the room entirely. Agnes stood up abruptly, her composure finally cracking completely. "You can't call the police. Laurel, please, we're family. We can work this out. I can explain everything." "Start explaining." I kept my voice level but implacable. Agnes began pacing, her hands fluttering nervously. "It wasn't supposed to be like this. Gary lost his job 6 months ago, and we've been struggling to keep up with the mortgage payments. Justin's architectural firm has been slow, and Maddie's been out of work since the baby." "What baby?" I interrupted. I hadn't seen any evidence of a baby in the house, and Maddie certainly didn't look like someone who had recently given birth. Maddie turned from the window, her face flushed with embarrassment. We lost the baby last month, but the medical bills and Justin had already taken time off work, and everything just got so complicated financially." A wave of sympathy threatened to undermine my resolve, but I forced myself to remember that grief and financial difficulty didn't justify fraud. "I'm sorry for your loss, truly, but that doesn't explain this elaborate scheme." Agnes stopped pacing and faced me directly. "We knew Coral had been talking about changing her will. She's made comments about your business success, about how responsible you are with money. We were afraid she was going to leave everything to you and cut out the rest of the family." "So you decided to cut me out first?" "We thought if we could get you to agree to a more equitable distribution, then when Coral did make changes, you wouldn't contest them. We thought if you believed she was dying and had already made arrangements, you would just accept them." The logic was so flawed, so dependent on my being naive and easily manipulated that it was almost insulting. Did they really think I would sign away inheritance rights without reading documents carefully? Did they assume I wouldn't want to speak directly with Coral about such major decisions? I looked around the room at these people who shared my blood, who had sat at family dinners and Christmas celebrations with me for decades, who had apparently been planning this deception for months while smiling to my face and accepting my gifts and good wishes. "Agnes," I said quietly, "did it ever occur to you to simply talk to me, to explain your financial difficulties and ask for help?" Her face crumpled. "You live so simply in Portland. We didn't think you had much money to spare, and we were embarrassed. Gary was supposed to be the successful one, the provider. Having to ask his wife's little sister for help felt like what? Like failure." I stood up from behind the desk, my decision crystallizing with perfect clarity. What they had done was unforgivable, but it had also revealed something important about our family dynamics that needed to be addressed. "Here's what's going to happen now," I said. You're all going to pack up and leave this house immediately. You're going to return any keys you have to Coral's property, and you're going to call her directly and apologize for this entire situation." "And then what?" Justin asked, his voice small. "Then," I said, pulling out my phone again, "I'm going to call some people who can help me understand exactly what legal remedies are available for this kind of attempted fraud. And we're all going to wait for Coral to get here so she can decide how she wants to handle this betrayal." As I began scrolling through my contacts, looking for the number of a law firm I had worked with on construction disputes, I realized that this evening had revealed something profound about my family's perception of me. They had no idea who they were really dealing with. And they were about to find out. The next hour unfolded like a carefully orchestrated demolition. I had learned from years of managing construction projects that once you identify structural weaknesses, you address them systematically and without sentimentality. My family's elaborate deception had revealed weaknesses that went far deeper than I had ever imagined. While Agnes, Justin, and Maddie huddled in increasingly frantic whispered conversations, I made a series of phone calls that began to unravel not just their immediate scheme, but their entire financial house of cards. My first call was to Rebecca Morrison, a criminal defense attorney I had worked with when one of my contractors had been accused of embezzlement. Rebecca had successfully defended him, but more importantly, she understood the legal implications of financial fraud. "Laurel, it's good to hear from you, though I'm guessing this isn't a social call at 9 o'clock on a Thursday night." "Unfortunately not. I need to understand the legal ramifications of a situation I've just discovered." I walked into Coral's library, closing the door behind me so I could speak privately. "What would you call it when family members fabricate a medical emergency to lure someone to a location where they attempt to pressure them into signing fraudulent legal documents that would affect inheritance rights?" The pause on the other end was telling. Jesus, Laurel, that's not just family drama. That's potentially several different felonies. Fraud, conspiracy, possibly elder abuse if they're targeting someone vulnerable. "Where are you right now?" "Charleston, at my aunt's house. She's not here, and she's not dying, despite what I was told. There are also 2 men here claiming to be an estate attorney and a financial advisor, but I'm beginning to suspect they're not who they claim to be." Jesus, Laurel, that's not just family drama. That's potentially several different felonies. Fraud, conspiracy, possibly elder abuse if they're targeting someone vulnerable. "Where are you right now?" "Charleston, at my aunt's house. She's not here, and she's not dying, despite what I was told. There are also 2 men here claiming to be an estate attorney and a financial advisor, but I'm beginning to suspect they're not who they claim to be." "Listen to me carefully," Rebecca said, her voice taking on the crisp tone she used in court. "Do not sign anything. Do not agree to anything verbally. If possible, try to record any further conversations. And if you feel unsafe at any point, call 911 immediately." After hanging up with Rebecca, I called my business partner in Portland, David Chen, who had access to professional background check services through his work in commercial real estate development. "David, I need a favor. Can you run background checks on 2 men? I have names, and I suspect they may not be who they claim to be." I gave him the information Curtis and Abernathy had provided. "I can have preliminary results within the hour," David assured me. "Are you okay? You sound stressed." "I'm discovering that people I trusted have been lying to me in ways I never imagined possible." My third call was to Dr. Eleanor Whitmore's house in Savannah. Coral answered on the first ring. "Laurel, dear, I've been thinking about our conversation. I'm driving back to Charleston tonight. I should be there within 2 hours." "Coral, before you come home, there are some things you need to know." I explained everything that had happened since my arrival, from the fake legal documents to the attempted pressure tactics to my discovery that she wasn't in the house at all. The silence on the other end of the line was profound. When Coral finally spoke, her voice carried a cold fury I had never heard before. "Laurel, I want you to listen to me very carefully. In my bedroom closet, behind the winter coats, there's a small safe. The combination is your birthday, month, day, year. Inside that safe, you'll find some documents that I think will be very relevant to this situation. What kind of documents? The real changes I've been making to my will, changes that your sister and nephew apparently decided they couldn't wait for me to implement properly. After ending the call with Coral, I returned to the study to find the atmosphere had deteriorated further. Curtis and Abernathy were arguing in hushed tones by the fireplace, while Agnes sat rigidly in her chair, staring at nothing. Justin was pacing by the windows, and Maddie had moved to sit on the arm of Agnes's chair, apparently trying to provide comfort. Before anyone decides to leave, I announced, I should probably mention that I've spoken with a criminal defense attorney about tonight's events. She's advised me that what's happened here constitutes several different felonies. Agnes's head snapped up, her eyes wide with what looked like genuine terror. Felonies? Laurel, you can't be serious. We're family. We weren't trying to hurt anyone. Intent doesn't change the legal definitions of fraud and conspiracy, I replied, and the fact that we're family actually makes some aspects of this worse, not better. My phone buzzed with a text from David. Quick preliminary check shows red flags. Quentin Curtis has no active bar license in SC. Jasper Abernathy has no financial advisor certifications on file. Want full reports? I showed the message to Curtis, watching his face go from red to gray in seconds. So, I said to the room in general, we have unlicensed individuals creating fraudulent legal documents as part of a conspiracy to defraud an elderly woman of her assets. I'm pretty sure federal prosecutors take this kind of thing seriously. It was Justin who broke first. Look, we can fix this. We can make it right. Nobody has to involve prosecutors or police or anyone else. We just call this whole thing off, everyone goes home, and we pretend it never happened. Pretend it never happened? I stared at him in disbelief. Justin, you and your mother fabricated your aunt's death to steal her money. You hired criminals to create fake legal documents. You lied to me for hours about a family emergency that doesn't exist. What part of that do you think I should just forget? Maddie finally spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. We didn't mean for it to go this far. It started as just trying to understand what Coral was planning, and then, when we realized she might leave everything to you, we panicked. The financial pressure has been so intense, and we thought— You thought what? That I was so naive I wouldn't notice the complete absence of a dying woman in a house where she was supposedly dying? The grandfather clock chimed 10 o'clock, and I realized that Coral would be arriving soon. Whatever reckoning was coming, these people needed to understand that their actions had consequences that extended far beyond this evening's embarrassment. Here's what's going to happen, I said, settling back into Coral's chair with a sense of authority I had never felt in family situations before. We're all going to wait for Coral to arrive. Then we're going to have a conversation about exactly how much damage you've done to this family and what it's going to take to repair it. And if we don't want to wait? Curtis asked, clearly calculating whether he could simply leave. I smiled, and it wasn't a particularly warm expression. Then I call the police right now and file formal fraud charges. Your choice. The room fell silent, except for the sound of Agnes quietly crying. They were beginning to understand that the woman they had tried to manipulate was not the person they thought they knew. Coral's headlights swept across the study windows at exactly 11:47 p.m., cutting through the darkness like a harbinger of judgment. The sound of her Mercedes pulling into the circular driveway sent a visible shudder through everyone in the room. Agnes had stopped crying, but looked like she might be sick. Justin had given up his restless pacing and stood frozen by the fireplace. Even the fraudulent Curtis and Abernathy seemed to shrink into themselves as we heard the front door open. Agnes? Justin? What the hell is going on in my house?
Coral's voice carried down the hallway with the kind of controlled fury that made grown business executives reconsider their life choices. At 76, she had lost none of the commanding presence that had built a hospitality empire from a single bed and breakfast in Savannah. She appeared in the study doorway like an avenging angel, dressed in an elegant cream-colored suit that somehow managed to look both sophisticated and intimidating. Her silver hair was perfectly styled despite the 2-hour drive, and her blue eyes swept the room with the kind of analytical precision that had made her fortune in real estate development. "Aunt Coral," Justin began, his voice cracking slightly, "we can explain." "Explain what?" she interrupted, her gaze moving from the fake documents scattered across the coffee table to the two men who suddenly looked like they wanted to disappear into the furniture. "Explain why my nephew called my hotel in Savannah tonight, claiming to be a doctor reporting my death? Explain why my niece received a phone call about my fictional stroke? Or explain why there are strangers in my house with fake legal documents?" The fact that someone had actually called the hotel posing as a doctor hit me like a physical blow. The deception had been even more elaborate than I had realized. Agnes tried to stand but seemed to lose her nerve halfway up. "Coral, we were scared. We heard you talking about changing your will, and with everything that's been happening financially, so you decided to fake my death and steal my money?" Coral's voice could have cut glass. "That was your solution to financial difficulties?" She walked to her desk where I was still sitting and placed a leather portfolio next to me. "Laurel, dear, did you find the documents I mentioned?" I nodded, placing the papers I had retrieved from her safe on the desk. "I think these are going to be very interesting for everyone to see." Coral opened the portfolio and pulled out a thick folder. 3 months ago, I did indeed make some changes to my estate planning, significant changes that apparently someone in this room learned about through methods they're going to explain to me in detail. She spread several documents across the desk surface, and I could see they were genuine legal papers with official seals and notarizations. "Would you like to know what those changes actually entailed?" The silence in the room was absolute. Even Curtis and Abernathy had stopped their nervous fidgeting. "I had decided," Coral continued, her voice carrying the weight of decades of business negotiations, "to leave my entire estate, the hotels, the real estate holdings, the investment portfolio, everything, to Laurel. Not because she needs the money, but because she's the only family member who has never asked me for anything." Agnes's gasp was audible. "The entire estate? But Coral, surely you didn't mean to exclude." "I meant exactly what I planned," Coral snapped. "But then something interesting happened. 3 weeks ago, I received a visit from a private investigator hired by someone in this room to research the details of my will and my recent meetings with attorneys." She pulled out a photograph and placed it on the desk. It showed Justin shaking hands with a man in a suit outside what appeared to be a law office. The investigator was thorough, but not particularly discreet. When I realized that family members were essentially spying on my private legal affairs, I decided to test their character. Coral's smile was sharp enough to cut diamonds. I let it be known, through carefully placed conversations, that I was concerned about Laurel's ability to manage inherited wealth responsibly. My stomach dropped as I realized what she was saying. "You mean," I began. "I mean this entire evening has been a test," Coral confirmed. "I wanted to see what Agnes and Justin would do with the information that I supposedly considered you incompetent to handle money. I wanted to see if they would try to manipulate the situation to their advantage." She gestured toward the fake documents on the coffee table. "What I discovered exceeded even my worst expectations. They didn't just plan to take advantage of what they thought was my diminished opinion of you. They fabricated my death to steal both our money." Justin finally found his voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. "You let us think you were cutting Laurel out of the will on purpose?" "I let you reveal your true character," Coral replied. "And what I've learned tonight is that my original instincts were absolutely correct. Laurel is indeed the only family member who can be trusted with significant wealth, because she's the only one who would never scheme to steal it from others." She turned to face Curtis and Abernathy, who looked like they were contemplating whether jumping out the window might be preferable to continue this conversation.
Gentlemen, I think it's time you explain exactly how much my sister paid you to impersonate legal professionals and create fraudulent documents. Curtis finally cracked under the pressure. $5,000 each. She said it was just to create some papers that would look official, that nobody would actually be hurt because you were going to change your will anyway. Interesting theory, Coral said dryly. Laurel, would you like to tell everyone what you discovered about these gentlemen's professional credentials? I cleared my throat, feeling like I was about to deliver a verdict in a trial. Neither of them has the professional licenses they claimed. Mr. Curtis isn't a practicing attorney, and Mr. Abernathy has no certifications as a financial advisor. They're essentially con artists hired to legitimize a fraud scheme. The words hung in the air like an indictment. Agnes had gone completely white, and I thought she might actually faint.
So, Coral said, settling into the chair across from her desk like a judge taking the bench, now that we all understand exactly what has happened here tonight, I think it's time to discuss consequences. The grandfather clock struck midnight, and I realized that in just a few hours, my perception of my family had been completely destroyed and rebuilt on an entirely different foundation. They had thought they were stealing from a naive woman who lived modestly and wouldn't fight back. They had no idea what they had actually unleashed. Coral stood behind her desk like a CEO addressing a board of directors who had just been caught embezzling, her presence filling the room with an authority that made everyone else seem small by comparison. The elegant woman who had always been the gracious hostess at family gatherings had been replaced by the steel-spined businesswoman who had negotiated million-dollar real estate deals in a male-dominated industry. Agnes, she said, her voice carrying the kind of quiet intensity that was somehow more terrifying than shouting, I want you to look at me and explain how you justified this to yourself. Agnes finally managed to stand, though she swayed slightly as if the weight of the confrontation was physically overwhelming her. Coral, I know how this looks, but we were desperate. Gary's been out of work for 8 months, not 6. We're 3 months behind on our mortgage. Justin's firm is failing, and after losing the baby, Maddie can't handle the stress of going back to work yet. So your solution was to fabricate my death and steal my inheritance? Coral's eyebrows rose in an expression of disbelief so profound it was almost comical. At what point in your planning process did that seem like a reasonable approach to financial difficulties? Justin stepped forward, his earlier confidence completely evaporated. Aunt Coral, we weren't trying to steal from you. We thought if we could get Laurel to agree to a more equitable distribution of assets, then when you actually did make changes to your will, there wouldn't be any family conflicts. Equitable? I couldn't help myself. You mean where you get money you haven't earned from an aunt you tried to convince me was dead? Maddie spoke up for the first time in hours, her voice thick with tears. We didn't think it would hurt anyone. We thought you lived simply because you didn't have much money, and we thought Coral would appreciate family harmony more than whatever this has become. Coral moved around the desk to stand directly in front of Agnes. Let me make sure I understand this correctly. You hired criminals to impersonate legal professionals? You fabricated a medical emergency involving my supposed death? You lied to Laurel about my condition to manipulate her into traveling across the country? You attempted to pressure her into signing fraudulent documents that would have affected her inheritance rights? And you did all of this because you assumed I was too senile to notice and she was too naive to figure it out? The summary of their actions, laid out in Coral's crisp business tone, sounded even worse than it had felt while I was living through it. Agnes's composure finally cracked completely. We're family, Coral. We've always been family. You can't just cut us out because of one mistake. One mistake? Coral's voice rose for the first time that evening. Agnes, you tried to steal millions of dollars through an elaborate fraud scheme. You traumatized your sister by making her believe I was dying. You violated the trust of every relationship in this family. What part of that do you consider one mistake?
The part where we're still your family and we still love you and we're still the same people we've always been, Justin said desperately. We made bad choices because we were scared and desperate, but we're not criminals. We're not evil people. Coral turned to look at him with an expression that could have frozen hellfire. Justin, you hired actors to impersonate my attorney and my financial advisor. You created fake legal documents designed to defraud your cousin. You lied about my health condition to manipulate her emotions. What exactly do you think criminals do that you haven't done tonight? The question hung in the air like a challenge that nobody wanted to accept. But we're family, Agnes repeated, as if that phrase could somehow undo the enormity of what they had attempted. Family forgives. Family works things out. You can't seriously be considering involving the police over a family misunderstanding. A family misunderstanding? I stood up from behind the desk, feeling a surge of anger that surprised me with its intensity. Agnes, you made me believe Coral was dying. Do you have any idea what that felt like? Do you understand the emotional trauma of rushing across the country to say goodbye to someone I love, only to discover it was all an elaborate lie designed to steal her money? We didn't mean to hurt you emotionally, Maddie said quietly. You thought I was stupid, I interrupted. You thought I was so naive and trusting that I would sign away inheritance rights without reading documents carefully or asking questions or wanting to speak directly with Coral about such major decisions. You built your entire scheme around the assumption that I was too incompetent to see through your lies? Agnes tried one more desperate approach. Laurel, please, we're sisters. We've been through everything together. Our parents' deaths, your divorce, Walter's passing. We've always supported each other through difficult times.
Supported each other? I stared at her in disbelief. Agnes, you've spent the last 20 years treating me like the unsuccessful sister who needed your pity and protection. You seated me at the children's table at family dinners. You forgot to include me in important family communications. You made comments about my simple lifestyle as if living modestly was something to be embarrassed about. Coral nodded approvingly. Exactly, which brings us to the other revelation from tonight's events. She pulled another document from her portfolio and placed it on the desk where everyone could see it. Agnes, Justin, I think it's time you learned something about your simple sister and cousin. Laurel, would you like to tell them about your actual financial situation, or shall I? I looked around the room at 5 people who had spent years underestimating me, who had built their entire fraud scheme around the assumption that I was financially naive and emotionally manipulable. I think, I said slowly, it's time for complete honesty in this family. The moment had come to reveal exactly who they had tried to defraud, and I was looking forward to seeing their faces when they learned the truth. I walked to the window where Maddie had been standing earlier, looking out at the moonlit gardens where I had played as a child, gathering my thoughts before revealing a truth that would change our family dynamics forever. For the past 15 years, I began, turning back to face the room, I've been living what you might call a deliberately modest lifestyle, not because I had to, but because I chose to. Agnes frowned, clearly struggling to understand where this was heading. What do you mean, chose to? I mean that the architectural consulting business I've been running in Portland has been extraordinarily successful, not just locally successful, internationally successful. I pulled out my phone and showed them a photo from a recent project. This is the sustainable housing development I just completed in partnership with the Norwegian government. The contract was worth $12 million. The silence in the room was profound. Justin's mouth had actually fallen open. I also own a commercial real estate portfolio in the Pacific Northwest worth approximately $37 million. I have investment accounts that generate more passive income annually than most people earn in their entire careers. And I've been quietly funding sustainable architecture projects around the world through a foundation I established 5 years ago. Coral smiled with obvious pride. Tell them about the Copenhagen project.
The United Nations commissioned me to design refugee housing that could be rapidly deployed in crisis situations. The prototype has been implemented in 7 countries, and the licensing agreements alone have generated more revenue than I can practically spend. Agnes sank back into her chair as if her legs could no longer support her. But you live in that small apartment. You drive a 15-year-old Subaru. You shop at thrift stores. I live in a small apartment because I don't need a mansion to be happy. I drive an old car because it's reliable and environmentally responsible. I shop at thrift stores because it's sustainable and because I enjoy finding unique pieces. I looked directly at her. I live modestly because I choose to, not because I have to. Justin finally found his voice. If you have that kind of money, why didn't you ever help us when we were struggling? The question revealed everything that was wrong with their thinking. Justin, when exactly did you ask for help? When did you call me and say, "Cousin Laurel, I'm having financial difficulties and could use some advice or assistance"? We didn't want to burden you, Maddie said weakly. No, I corrected. You didn't want to admit to someone you considered less successful that you needed help. You were comfortable accepting what you thought was Coral's charity, but you never considered that I might be in a position to offer assistance. Coral leaned forward. The irony, of course, is that if you had simply been honest about your financial difficulties, both Laurel and I would have been happy to help. Instead, you chose to try to steal what you thought you deserved. Agnes was crying again, but these tears seemed different, less self-pity and more genuine remorse. We've destroyed everything, haven't we? Our relationship with you, with Laurel, our family reputation. That depends, Coral said. What do you mean? Justin asked. I returned to sit behind Coral's desk, feeling the weight of this moment. It means you have a choice. You can continue believing that you're victims of circumstances who deserve special consideration because we're family, or you can take responsibility for your actions and start rebuilding trust through honest behavior. How do we do that? Agnes asked, her voice small. You start, Coral said firmly, by apologizing to every person you've wronged tonight. Then you return the money you paid these fraudsters. Then you figure out how to solve your financial problems through legitimate means instead of elaborate deception. And then, Maddie whispered, I looked at my sister, my nephew, and his wife, people I had loved my entire life who had just revealed themselves capable of breathtaking betrayal. Then, I said slowly, this family can learn to function based on honesty instead of assumptions. 6 months later, I stood in the same study where my family had tried to defraud me, but everything felt different. The room was filled with afternoon sunlight streaming through windows that Coral had recently had professionally cleaned, and the atmosphere carried none of the tension and deception that had poisoned it that October night.
Agnes sat across from me at the small table where we had been reviewing business plans for the past hour. Her appearance had changed dramatically. Gone were the expensive clothes and perfectly styled hair, replaced by practical work attire and a hairstyle she maintained herself. More importantly, the brittle desperation that had driven her to such extreme measures had been replaced by something that looked like genuine peace. The restaurant is actually turning a profit now, she said, pointing to the financial statements spread between us. Small profits, but consistent ones. Gary's found his calling in the kitchen, and I think I'm better suited to front-of-house management than I ever was to being a socialite. After that terrible night, Agnes and Gary had used the last of their savings to lease a small cafe space in downtown Charleston. Instead of trying to maintain their former lifestyle through deception, they had chosen to rebuild through honest work. The transition hadn't been easy. They had lost their house to foreclosure and were now renting a modest apartment above the restaurant. But Agnes seemed genuinely happier than I had seen her in years. I'm proud of you, I said, and meant it. It takes courage to start over at this stage of life. Agnes smiled, and for the first time in decades, it reached her eyes. You know what's strange? I thought losing everything would feel like failure, but it actually feels like freedom. I don't have to pretend anymore that we could afford things we couldn't. I don't have to worry about keeping up appearances that were bankrupting us. Justin appeared in the doorway, carrying his infant daughter Emma, named for Eleanor Whitmore, whose guest cottage he and Maddie now rented in Savannah.
The baby had been born 3 months ago, healthy and beautiful, and had somehow helped heal some of the wounds from their earlier loss. "How's the Portland project coming?" he asked, settling into a chair near the window where Maddie had stood that night, plotting my manipulation. "Final approvals should come through next week," I replied. "The city council is excited about the affordable housing prototype. If this pilot program succeeds, they want to scale it citywide." Justin nodded approvingly. After his architectural firm had failed, he had swallowed his pride and asked if he could work as a junior consultant on some of my sustainable housing projects. His talent had always been significant. He had just needed to learn humility and genuine collaboration. Working under my direction had been difficult for him initially, but it had also forced him to develop skills he had never bothered to cultivate when he assumed family connections would smooth his path. "Aunt Laurel," he said, using the title that had once felt formal but now carried genuine affection. "I know I've said this before, but I need to say it again. I'm sorry. Not just for that night, but for years of treating you like you were somehow less than us." "I know," I replied, "and I forgive you. But more importantly, you've forgiven yourself and changed your behavior." Coral entered the study carrying a tea service, moving with the same elegant efficiency she had always possessed. At 77, she showed no signs of slowing down, and the revelation of her family's betrayal seemed to have energized rather than defeated her. "I have news," she announced, settling the tray on the coffee table. "The Foundation Board has approved funding for Laurel's next 3 international projects. We're going to change how the world thinks about emergency housing." She poured tea for everyone, a ritual that had become central to our monthly family meetings. These gatherings bore no resemblance to the stilted holiday dinners of the past. Instead of performance and pretense, we had built something based on honest communication and mutual respect. "There's something else," Coral continued, her eyes twinkling with mischief. "I've decided to make one final change to my will." Agnes tensed slightly, old habits dying hard, but Justin just smiled. "Whatever you think is best, Aunt Coral. We've learned to trust your judgment." "I'm leaving everything to charity," Coral announced cheerfully. "Every penny. The hotels, the real estate, the investment accounts, all of it will fund scholarships for women in business and architecture." The silence that followed was brief and comfortable, rather than shocked. "That's perfect," I said, raising my teacup in a toast. "Here's to using wealth to create opportunities rather than dependence." Agnes raised her cup as well, to family relationships built on love rather than money. Justin and Maddie joined the toast, baby Emma gurgling happily in her father's arms. As the afternoon sun painted the study in golden light, I reflected on how that terrible October night had ultimately saved our family. By forcing us to confront our worst impulses and deepest assumptions, the crisis had cleared away decades of dysfunction and created space for something healthier to grow. The woman who had been dismissed and manipulated at this very table 6 months ago had discovered reserves of strength she had forgotten she possessed. More importantly, she had learned that sometimes the most loving thing you can do for people is refuse to enable their worst behavior. My family had thought they were stealing my inheritance. Instead, they had given me something far more valuable, the knowledge that I was strong enough to demand the respect I deserved, and generous enough to forgive when genuine change followed genuine remorse. Looking around the room at people who had tried to betray me and then worked to earn back my trust, I realized that this was what real family looked like. Not perfect, but honest. Not easy, but worth fighting for. And for the first time in decades, that felt like enough.
Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.